Welcome to the CSCA of Montreal. Today we have a special speaker, Patrick Franklin, who will be speaking about science and faith in response to the problem of suffering. The CSCA is a sister organization to the ASA, which is the American Scientific Affiliation. We are the Canadian expression of it. And I'm the Montreal lead. And I have a committee. My committee contains Roy and Maria, but we're also looking for more committee members. So if anybody in this room is interested in helping us organize and plan and think about what should be done, we're definitely interested in having more participation from people. Patrick Franklin is Associate Professor of Theology at Tyndale University in Toronto. Patrick is a Fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation and serves as a past president of the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation, which is the affiliation that we're a part of, that I'm a part of. And so he's the past president of it. He is the author of Being Human, Being Church, the Significance of Theological Anthropology for Ecclesiology, and of several peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, including publications that contribute to the faith-science conversation. In the past few years, Patrick and his wife have personally navigated questions related to suffering in relation to faith and science, as they have faced two major health crises and then the toll of these crises that take on children and family. So I would like to welcome Patrick to speak with us.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to be here with you. Back in Montreal, I actually spoke at a CSCA event back in 2019. So I don't know if anybody came up to that. I don't remember. And I spoke on the topic of reading Genesis, early chapters of Genesis, kind of like do's and don'ts, and particularly in light of the questions we bring with respect to science and thinking through different perspectives, including evolution and so forth. So that was a lot of fun, and it's good to be back here. I've got some friends in the area, so thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out. Thank you for your attention. So my topic tonight is faith and science in response to the problem of suffering. And this is going to be a bit of a different talk, perhaps, than what I usually give, because usually I'm doing something sort of philosophical or maybe something that's bridging the two areas. Suffering is such an interesting topic because it's so existential. It's not just abstract. It's not just something you can kind of talk about way up here. It's something that impacts us at a personal level. And I am a theologian, so I'm going to think about suffering from a theological perspective. And then toward the end of the lecture, ask some questions about how science can be engaged in questions concerning suffering. So I'm going to walk us through a few different things. I'm going to start by telling my own story a little bit. So it was mentioned in the abstract or the introduction that we've navigated some issues related to suffering in the last few years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about some intellectual responses to the problem of suffering. So we hear about the problem of pain, the problem of suffering in terms of issues that presents to faith or belief in God. I'm going to look at some of those, but also maybe on how they're not super satisfying when it comes to personal suffering. And then that's going to lead to a question, what do we mean by God anyway? Well, when we talk about suffering and God, we tend to take for granted what it is we're talking about. But what are we talking about exactly? And then I want to talk about, well, if God is a certain kind of being, then what might be a fitting response to suffering? Because I think that's actually a good place to go with this. So that's where we're going to go tonight. And I want to start with my own story a little bit. So this is a good friend of mine. We were only getting to know each other before my big health crisis hit. And through it, we became very, very close friends. So that was one of the positive outcomes of going through that experience. I want to also mention that I want to engage a little bit with this book written by Todd Billings, who's also a theologian and a biblical scholar. He kind of works with Bible and theology. And he was diagnosed some years ago with an incurable form of cancer. I want to get it right. Multiple myeloma. So it's incurable. It's a blood cancer. And he lives with that. And in reading through his book, I just found his reflections to be profound. I found that a lot of what he talks about, I'm like, oh, I remember feeling like that. I remember thinking that. But he's still living that. And he knows that he's only got so much time, and he's got young children, and all the questions that brings, right? Your life is redefined from that point forward. And what meaning do you make of it? How do you engage it? How do you face it honestly, and yet not morbidly at the same time? He talks to Farah. So I'm going to engage with him a little bit because I found his book to be really helpful, and I wanted to recommend it to you as well. So this is July 27th, 2019. The last time I had spoken in Montreal was that year. It was a little bit earlier in the year. And this is during the summer. I had actually just recently returned from an ASA conference down in the States, in the Boston area. And this is my family. So my wife is up front there, kids in the background. And then a good friend who's an Old Testament scholar was visiting from out of province. And so we were all having a good time together. No idea what was about to take place the very next night. And so the next night is when the crisis hit. I was playing baseball, of all things. You don't do a whole lot in baseball. And friends of mine noticed that I was acting very strangely. It wasn't just that I was missing balls. I would sort of stare at the ball until it almost hit me in the face and then get my glove up at the last minute. And they were like, what's going on here? So one of them said, Patrick, are you doing okay? I said, yeah, I think so. I'm just feeling a bit off. My stomach's bothering me. I think I ate too much at supper. But then I started to complain. I don't remember this, by the way. I started to complain about some numbness and a little bit of pressure in the chest area. And so she said, should I take you to the hospital? I said, no, I think I can sit for a bit. She said, are you sure? I said, okay, well, let's go. So she took me. And on the way, we called an ambulance and we called the hospital rather, and they just said, well, there's nothing really we can do. Just we can send an ambulance or you can just come. So we decided to just go. And probably about 2 minutes from the hospital, I seized and had a cardiac arrest. And so got to the hospital and they had to drag me out. They began chest compressions. They did that for about 20 minutes. They did defibrillators, zapped me about 10 times. They did not give up on me. So this was the Widowmaker heart attack, if you're familiar with that. It's in this diagram, there's a 95% blockage to the alleviate artery, and that's the artery that feeds the majority of blood to the heart. Mine was 100% blockage, and it really came out of nowhere. It's amazing that they were able to revive me because the survival rate's quite low. And when they were talking to my wife about the procedure, they made sure she knew that there was no guarantees. Right? It's easy to go through an arterial wall, and so on. And so they performed all of that time in terms of trying to revive me and to get me into the procedure for that. And but they were able to be successful and to revive me, and all was looking good. And then in the next couple of days, things just started to really crash. Sometimes things can happen, complications set in. So when I seized up, I also vomited. That can lead to taking it into your lungs. That can cause sepsis. That can lead to pneumonia. I ended up with an extreme lung condition called ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And it's a very dangerous condition. It's often lethal as well. And then it was just really one thing after another. It was multiple organ shutdown, kidney failure. My pancreas shut down. Everything was kind of shutting down. There were multiple bleeds. They suspected brain bleeds. There were suspected strokes, blotching all over my body. To deal with the ARDS, they ended up pronating me, doing a pronating kind of where they turn the bed upside down and all that kind of stuff. But very, very dangerous. So I was in an induced coma for about a month. And my wife and kids were called in several times to say he's very unlikely not going to make the night. And so what they went through was quite extreme. So let me just say, if you're squeamish about pictures, there's nothing graphic, but if hospital scenes are triggering for you, feel free to look away. Again, it's nothing graphic, but so this is me on a respirator, ventilator, and I ended up, initially the goal was to put me on one for 24 hours, and that turned into 48, and that turned into 4 days, and that turned into 8 days. And still 25 days, I was still on that. And eventually they were able to trach me and get it off. That's my daughter. She's missing her dad. Things were looking very bleak. My wife was writing was writing a blog post through the entire thing. Part of that was just so that you don't have to talk to 100 people individually. It's not doable. And I'm going to share that link with you because her writing's really quite insightful and profound. And one of the things that friends following felt was just, I'd almost be afraid to go on because how can this get worse? And then it got worse, and then it got worse, and then it got worse. So these are some good friends of mine. These are actually the two that drove me to the hospital who noticed that I was acting strangely. These are some friends that visited. I'm not actually fully with it. There's really interesting things that go on. I actually remember this conversation, and I can actually talk to them about well, we didn't talk because I wasn't talking about what they talked to me about. But in my mind, I was not there. I was in some dark, dingy tunnel somewhere because I was in some military complex and there were experiments going on me and all this kind of stuff. So I was in a very different kind of world. There's a lot of drugs, a lot of fentanyl coming off some of that. Here's another visit from a colleague. And again, I remember this conversation because this is really when I was starting to break into consciousness. But again, kind of sort of there, sort of not there. There are some quite terrifying memories that I have about some of the delusions that my brain created around what was going on. So here is my family. Everybody's kind of being themselves. My daughter that's fully who she is. My one son sort of standing back. The other son sort of helping out. This is one of the early times going outside. It was such a relief to see the sun and be out, but it was also hard because it was hard to be sitting. When I first was sitting up again, like your whole sense of balance changes and I just fall right over again. And I didn't have any strength. I had lost like 40 or 50 pounds. And because I had this other condition where at a cellular level, my body was sort of eating itself. And so I had to learn how to swallow again because I had a neurological, slight neurological delay. And I had to learn to sit up and I had to learn to stand and then to walk and, one thing at a time. This is us at the chapel at St. Mary's Hospital in Kitchener. This is a gathering on a Sunday. And I remember this time where we're worshiping. We're having a little church service in the hospital room. And even one of the nurses joined us. It's really cool. And I raised my hands. I'm not even really charismatic, but I was like, I'm raising them because I can raise them. Because that was quite the thing. My daughter here is massaging my feet. I had nerve damage and that was tough. And my feet, all the skin peeled off my feet. Weird things. This is one of my sons feeding me. Because if I did it myself, I'd just spill all over myself. Couldn't quite do it yet. Times of reflection, a lot of gratitude, sensing God's presence. This is standing again for the first time. And looks like I'm standing, but I probably was only able to do it for 3 or 4 seconds. I felt like I weighed 500 pounds. And this is at the recovery hospital, where I ended up a little later. This looks like it's the end, but at the very tail end of this, just for an extra bit of, icing on the cake, I ended up with C. difficile because of all the antibiotics that decimated the bacteria in my system. And so I got this superbug resistant to normal antibiotics. And I ended up back in the other hospital for another 2 weeks to deal with that. And then we finally got to leave and go home on Thanksgiving weekend. And in a way, I left the hospital early just because of space issues. But it was really the best thing to go home and to just engage daily life. It was just really good for healing. A long, long journey. I was off work for the next year. And then I went back the year after that, part-time. And now I'm back full-time. Early reports when I had left the hospital said that there was severe and extensive damage to my heart. My kidneys did come back on, but for a long time that was not a given. And I was doing dialysis several times a week. And so there was a lot of unknowns, a lot of things to ponder, and that's sitting there with that coffee, a lot of pondering going on. Amazingly, I have very little damage to my heart. My kidneys came back; they function at about 50%, which is not bad. And I'm very thankful and grateful to be alive. This is the website I was mentioning where my wife blogs through, and she just does an amazing job, not only with what she says and the story she shares, and many have commented on just how engaging it is, but the comments and the community that got involved around us, it's just mind-blowing. And we didn't know necessarily all these people, but just a testament to what the power of community and what you need when you're suffering. You need people to carry you because you can't carry yourself. So some intellectual, and by the way, I share that story just to share a little bit about suffering. I make no claims that my suffering is particularly worse than other people's suffering. This is just my story. In fact, at the very same time I was recovering, we had a very dear friend go through the dying process of cancer. And she was in her late 30s. She had 4 kids under 10. Very, very tragic. And so part of my recovery, I felt some of that survival guilt. I never asked sort of like, why me? Like, why is this happening to me? I was kind of like, why not me? Lots of people in the world suffer, go hungry, die. But it was kind of like, why do I get to survive and she doesn't? That was hard. And so I know, for what it's worth, that was my journey. We're dealing with one now as well. My wife is, dealing with cancer, and we're doing that journey with her. And, there's been some, good moves forward and some setbacks as well, but we're still not out of it. We're still in the midst of it. So theodicy is that area of theology that deals with questions of suffering and pain and evil as they relate to God and having faith in God. As we know, those questions are some of the most profound objections that atheists or maybe agnostics will pose to people of faith. If God is good, how can there be all of this in the world, right? C.S. Lewis puts the problem very succinctly and helpfully, I think. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either the goodness or the power or both. So some common responses to that, what we call theodicies, or ways of making sense of God's goodness and God's greatness in light of suffering and evil. And I'm just going to kind of put everyday language around these. One approach would be to try to minimize suffering in some way. I don't think that's the intention, but sometimes that's what happens. So, for example, when somebody says something like, everything happens for a reason, sometimes that has the effect of kind of minimizing the suffering, because if it can be explained, rationally, then it seems to be in some sense more manageable. Very cynically, I don't know about this crowd, but if anybody's seen the movie The Dark Knight, there's the Joker character who kind of cynically comments on this, and he kind of says, if some drug dealer dies in the middle of nowhere, nobody bats an eye because it's all part of the plan, right? But you kill the assistant DA, and everybody just loses their mind, right? Because that's not supposed to happen. And it's this kind of idea, but it's troubling in a way, because if we can start to say, well, certain things make sense and are supposed to happen and other things aren't, that can almost justify the kind of status quo. It can downplay just how serious a problem that suffering is for those people that experience it. And if there are any people of faith or people who aren't, sometimes I'm sure you've gone through something and somebody has said something like, everything happens for a reason. And that can feel like it's minimizing what you're going through. Another would be just to say an approach that says, well, have faith and focus on the positive, right? This might be in the direction of, if you have enough faith, God will heal you. Or if you just kind of put a positive spin on it, you can bear what's going on. I'm not saying these responses are completely useless, by the way. They have a place, but they can also at times maybe ring a bit hollow. Another way of doing this is to say, well, think about the afterlife, because this life is temporary, and there's the afterlife. We'll get to go to heaven or whatever, and all will be compensated. And so this can be actually quite encouraging, especially for those who are facing maybe imminent death. The criticism of that, of course, coming from somebody like Marx is that can actually sort of cause us to be a bit ho-hum about the status quo, right? Well, don't worry, everybody's going to heaven. So we don't need to take present suffering or inequality or class distinctions all that seriously. Now, if you're not a person of faith, maybe sometimes this could take the form of, well, don't worry, just think about your legacy, right? It's like, well, that kind of gives us comfort in the midst of, but on the other hand, like, who cares? I won't be here to enjoy it, so that can ring kind of hollow as well. Another approach would be in the opposite direction. It would be to minimize God's power and thus to minimize maybe God's responsibility. It comes in the form of something like this, right? God feels your pain, but simply lacks the power to do anything about it. So it's kind of taking these two themes, one God's goodness, the other God's greatness, and it just diminishes the greatness a little bit to kind of let God off the hook, right? So God isn't maybe as responsible if God's not actually able to do anything about it, right? And that kind of response actually been growing in popularity in some ways. And maybe it comes out of a reflection that God himself is a victim of suffering in some ways. God grieves or is involved with the world and feels its suffering, or Christ dying, might play into this kind of idea where God himself is a victim and is suffering. And there's truth to this. On the other hand, I think that my own perspective, anyway, this has the problem of feeling like a bit of a cop-out. Like we could say, okay, God doesn't have the power to do it, but it's almost like we're sort of changing the definition of God in order to face that, make this our own struggles with suffering easier, maybe. And then there are various forms of the free will defense. And this is the idea that God creates a degree of freedom in the world, particularly for human beings. And that entails God making room for the free choices that human beings make. And so if we're going to have some degree of freedom, that's going to entail that you can go one way or the other, and that we could not do God's will at certain times. Now, this gets spliced out in a whole variety of ways, but it includes making distinctions like God has a will, but God has priorities that are ranked in his will. So, for example, God wills that we would do the good, but God also wills our freedom. And he doesn't want to just create robots. He wants to create creatures who engage with him, who love him, who interact with him on that larger level. And so that involves some degree of quote unquote risk, you might say, right? And so God's got ranked priorities. He wants us to be good, but not at the cost of not actually being human, not actually being like him and having freedom. So there's a distinction made between God's active versus God's permissive will. We even do this ourselves to a certain degree. Like I might say, like, I disagree with a whole bunch of people politically, but I believe that they should be able to believe what they believe and say what they think, because I rank democracy ahead of my ranking of my own, personal will being just authoritarianly, is that even a word, executed, right? So I can have a political will, but I can rank that in terms of it's actually more important that we have this public space. And then on top of that, now I'm going to have my other priorities, right? So in a similar way, God would ordain certain things and permit certain things. God prioritizes the creation of free beings. And then also a distinction is often made that there are multiple levels of causation in play, right? So this goes all the way back to Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas talks a little bit about this, that in any event, there could be different levels of causation. So some of them relate to agency, others might relate to the sort of means. So there's different ways of thinking about causation. Here's a quote from Todd Billings. So he's the one I talked about a little bit earlier. He says, he's talking about this perspective, when the confessions from the Reformation used the term ordained in this sense, it should not be construed in a monocausal way. God the King ordains through means, secondary causality. And this ordaining or willing may be active or it may be permissive. So the free will defense, I think, is an important defense in terms of a theodicy. It has the weakness, though, of having difficulty explaining things like natural evil, the natural disasters, earthquakes and tornadoes, and the kind of suffering that seems to appear to us to be kind of chaotic and not the result of human bad choices. Okay, so I want to move on now and say these theodicies, I think, can be partially helpful, but in kind of an abstract way, and usually not super helpful to the person who's actually experiencing suffering at an existential level. So if someone's going through something horrific and the response is to give one of these theodicies, it can almost feel dehumanizing. It can almost feel like, really I'm spouting off and I'm angry and I'm yelling at God even, but I'm actually not interested in intellectual debate, right? I need to be heard. Now, there's a place for these kinds of ways of understanding and philosophizing and thinking, but it's probably usually not in the midst of somebody's pain. So another question that I think we need to ask is when we talk about, justifying belief in God in the midst of suffering, we have to think about what do we mean by God? What do we mean by God? Now, theodicies generally arose after the Enlightenment, and the kind of God envisioned in the Enlightenment is a very distant kind of deity that can operate in the abstract. And so for some of these thinkers, it kind of fit that way of thinking to think of God as almost like a divine consequentialist, right? Just optimizing the system, right? So everything's existing for a kind of reason. People do have freedom, but whatever's going to maximize the most good has just been optimized. That might be one sort of approach to that. It just sucks to be you if you're not one of the ones that benefits from that optimization project. But often, again, what do we mean by God in this kind of context? It's actually not usually the God of the Bible or the God of the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition. It's kind of this abstract old man in the sky, right? With the beard, maybe the God of the Monty Python universe who parts the clouds and kind of grumpy and distant, very masculine and all of that, right? So sometimes this is the God we have in mind. This is important to realize because theodicies make assumptions and so also objections to theodicy, or skeptical rejections of theodicy also make assumptions about, what exactly do we mean by God? So what I mean when I talk about God, and here's just a few examples of that, right? So when we talk about God, if God were good, what do we mean by good? Do we mean nice? What exactly do we mean? And then what do we mean by almighty? Do we mean almighty in that sense of God being the great sort of optimizer who's cold and calculating? Is that what almighty means? And what does it mean for creatures to be happy? Some things that are good for us don't make us happy. Right? Taking a young child to get a vaccine, they don't understand it. They don't like it. But it's good for them, right? It's for their benefit. The parent knows, the child doesn't understand. So what I want to have in mind, and this is just because this is where I come from, this is my tradition, and I want to kind of just bring these two things into dialogue tonight in terms of how I've thought about suffering in light of this God. The God I have in mind is the triune God of the Bible. And this matters because this God is not a generic, abstract kind of deity where we can just speculate and operate in these large, abstract kind of levels. This is a God who is unique and particular, and who is portrayed concretely in the Bible and even named, right? Given a name by Israel, Yahweh, the name Yahweh. So this is a nameable God. And this is a God who makes promises and keeps promises and binds himself to a people, and is very personal. And there's lots of anthropomorphism going on in the Bible. God is depicted in human terms. And this is to really bring out the personal nature of God, right? And sometimes we have to be able to sift through what exactly is a text saying when it's portraying God in this way. That takes some work sometimes. But just to outline this a little bit, and again, these are just propositional statements. There's always danger in this because it's sort of like the highlights of the Bible. The narratives really matter. It's one thing for me to show the Lord of the Rings films or to read the novels, right, of the Lord of the Rings. It's another thing for me to say, well, here are the 5 points on the screen that tell you what the Lord of the Rings is about. So all you need is the points, right? Story doesn't matter. It's you can almost miss the point. Okay, so the narratives matter, but nevertheless, I just want to point to a few things about who this God is. So this is the God who is the creator of a very good physical world. That's different than a lot of ancient Near Eastern depictions of the cosmos. The cosmos isn't unambiguously good in a lot of accounts. It results from, gods being at war with each other, and one gets ripped in half, and so there's an inherent violence to the universe in some of these views. But in the Genesis account, God creates, and he loves what he creates. And materiality is good, embodied existence is good, sex is good, because right at the beginning he says, I'm going to make these creatures, I'm going to tell them to go and multiply and fill the earth. That's not after sin enters the world, that's before. So this is a God who loves the body, who loves the world, who loves materiality. One God. And I highlight the oneness, not to say this is our God and our God's better than your God, and so our nation's better than your nation. It's actually the reverse kind of idea. This is the one God who made everything. And because of that, this is not a tribal deity that plays favorites. Right in the beginning of the Bible, you get this very counterintuitive notion that was pretty unique in the ancient Near East to say this God who made everything, right, is not just the kind of one who ideologically secures the place of the nation to be the one chosen people and everybody else is just whatever, we're just going to take over. Actually, it's the reverse. This is the God not just of the Israelites, but of the Egyptians, of the entire world. And the passage actually kind of goes out of its way to say every human being is made in the image of this God that bears dignity and value. Now, in Egypt, you get the idea of humans made in the image of God, but it's not all humans. It's the Pharaoh, right? And it's this nation because this nation is going to become a colonial power. But the Genesis account kind of undoes that whole idea. It's counterintuitive. It's very different. Exodus, this is the unveiling of the divine name in this book, and then God showing himself to Moses, declaring the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and in faithfulness. And that's a covenantal statement that gets repeated over and over again. I know the Old Testament can get confusing. There's a lot going on, but this is one of those notes that it keeps coming back to. If you think about a big musical piece, right, with all these themes, this one kind of is that basic, cantus firmus that it comes back to. God is a liberator, liberating his people from slavery and oppression. First from the Egyptians who enslaved, and then later from Babylon for being in captivity there. This God is a faithful covenant partner. One of the most shocking books in the Old Testament is the story of Hosea, the prophet. And what God does is tells Hosea, I want you to marry this woman, and your marriage is going to be a sign of my covenant with my people. And the woman that Hosea is instructed to marry is actually a prostitute. And he's to marry her, and even though she keeps running and engages in unfaithfulness to him, Hosea, God says you still need to pursue her, you still need to honor your commitment to her and be married to her. And because this is actually a picture of my people and me, God's saying. Right? It's a dramatic picture of a faithful covenant partner, even in the face of unfaithfulness. And this is a God who has concern for justice for all, for widows, for orphans, for the aliens in the midst of the Israelite people. And there's some really interesting, even legal material that protects them. And it's a God who is personal. There's a very strong theme of dwelling, that this is a God that wants to dwell with his people. And that's a theme that goes from Genesis all the way to the end of Revelation. And then we move to the New Testament. This is a God who became human and dwelt among us. So that dwelling theme comes up right in the beginning of the Gospel of John, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us, became sacred space in our midst. This one is God's Word personified in a person. This is the light, the way, the truth, the life. This God enters into our world and even enters into our suffering through the person of Jesus. This is a redeemer who sacrifices himself. That is just a quotation from one of the Pauline letters. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, in Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And then Revelation, kind of looking forward to the end, the risen Jesus saying, I am making all things new. And then you get these interesting statements in the early church theologians, and they pick up on what's been called the divine exchange theme. And it kind of goes like this. He took what was ours, being human, and being dejected, being mocked, being ridiculed, being subject to death, so that we could have what is his, eternal life, acceptance, and so forth. And it's a great deal for us. It's a bit of a bum deal for him. Or Athanasius, he became human that we might be divinized. Not that we become God, but that we become the image of God, like we were meant to be. What he has not assumed, he has not healed. So the sense that God takes on what we are in order to heal it from within. Or Martin Luther, Lord Jesus, you are my righteousness, just as I am your sin. You have taken upon yourself what is mine and have given to me what is yours. You have taken upon yourself what you were not and have given to me what I was not. And these go back to biblical themes like this. He who was rich for your sake became poor so that you through his poverty could be made rich. Or God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Or again, for if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. And then finally, I have been crucified with Christ, so I'm dead, and yet I'm alive. But it's no longer me who's living, it's Christ in me. So it's this exchange theme that's actually quite interesting and powerful. You see this all over the place in the early church writers reflecting on the implications of the gospel. And so this is a God who makes and keeps promises, very personal, yet is other and mysterious, and whose will and plan can often elude us. And when we try to figure it out, we often get it wrong. I want to talk for a few minutes about the book of Job, because it's a book in the Bible that has a lot to say about suffering and then human explanations of suffering. So theodicies, again, you might call them. Now, Job is a man who undergoes pretty extreme suffering and loss. He undergoes all kinds of diseases. He loses his family. His children die. He's essentially left alone. He's in a place of severe suffering. But it's also very clear from this book that it's not because he's a bad person. In fact, Job is an upright person. He's a moral person. He loves God. He's a godly man. He's a righteous man. And yet all of this stuff befalls him. And Job has these friends, and they're all kind of pointing to him at this picture, right? They're trying to help him. But like some of these theodicies, they kind of have a place, but on the other hand, they can feel like accusation if they're given in the wrong way at the wrong time. And so there's a scholar named David Burrell who talks about them, and he says these three friends represent three different types of approaches. The first of them represents what he calls the dogmatist. And this is sort of thinking of things like way from above, this abstract kind of a God almost. And the idea is that, well, God is disciplining you, right? You're going through this stuff. And so you should be glad, because if God's disciplining you, that means he cares about you. So there's a plan in all this, right? You're being disciplined, just focus on that and be glad, right? The second one is the jurist, and he's focused on the question of justice and tries to reassure Job, well, if you're pure and if you're upright, God will act to set things right and to bring about justice again. So just make sure you're being pure and upright so that can happen. And then thirdly, the philosopher. Don't question God, because God is transcendent. His thoughts are so far above our thoughts. His ways are so far above our ways. And so he's just transcendent. This is just not something you could understand. And so you just need to kind of maybe reflect on that abstract notion of transcendence and maybe have that, distract you from your suffering or something. Now, I should mention, again, like I said before, it's not that these are completely wrong ideas. Like sometimes God does discipline his people. Sometimes there is this sense where God acts to bring about justice because some people are acting in an unjust way. And sometimes we do have to remember that God's transcendent. We can't possibly understand, what he's doing. Sometimes people will say things like, there could just be no reason at all that such an event could happen. There couldn't be possibly any justification for that happening. That would sort of, where the good outweigh the bad. But that's a really impossible statement to make if you think about it. Like, to actually know that, you would have to have infinite knowledge of all possibilities and all counter possibilities in order to make that kind of a judgment. And the point is, none of us has it, either one way or the other. So in any case, God's response is actually quite interesting. He very strongly rejects everything that Job's friends are telling him. And there are several chapters where God gives these big speeches, and it basically just sort of puts them into place and says, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. So we do have to be very careful when we speak into people's suffering and try to provide sort of explanations for why they're happening, because, it could be that that's true, but we really don't know. We really don't know. We have to be careful. So God rejects the speculative answers given by Job's friends as explanations / justifications of why they're experiencing what they're experiencing. Here's a quote from another writer, Daniel Costello. He says, fascinating in this final reproach of Job's friends is that they come under God's wrath when purportedly they were all along trying to preserve God's character in the face of Job's plight. They're just trying to be good theologians, you might say, defend God's honor. With God's chastisement of Job's friends, we have here a form of divine wrath directed against a kind of divinely framed justification of suffering. Isn't that interesting? So one of the thoughts I've had throughout this is that, theodicies can be a little bit difficult. There is a place for them, but they don't often work super well as a kind of rational defense that's just an obvious defense of God's existence. I was thinking about this because the difference between what you mean by God and what you don't mean by God makes all the difference. If what I have in mind is this old man in the sky who's abstract, distant, maybe like the Enlightenment thinkers, he set up the world sort of like a watch, wound it up, let it go, isn't involved, doesn't care. If that's God, then we really have trouble with some of these theodicies. I was thinking of this personally. I was thinking, if there was a random person that I didn't know that did some inexplicable act, I could sort of philosophize or speculate as to why that person did that. But it's all very speculative, right? And maybe the act is a little bit ambiguous. I don't know if this person intended good or intended bad to me. I really don't know, right? And it looks like the evidence depends on how I paint it. Could go one way, could go the other. But if this person is my wife, that changes everything. It changes the whole tenor of what's gone on, because I have personal knowledge of this person. I know that she loves me, that she cares for me. And frankly, she gets the benefit of the doubt. So even if there's some evidence that's come along that's portrayed her in a bad light, it's not because I can philosophize better and find a more rational explanation. There's a place for that. I got to use my reason. I'm not just going to ignore the evidence. On the other hand, the fact that I know her deeply, and I know her character and the promises she's made and what she's done for me changes everything. She kind of gets the benefit of the doubt. And now it's a different kind of scenario. So the explanations, the theodicies actually support my faith. They don't create it. Right? So it's that I have this faith in my wife, and in the face of this ambiguous evidence, I can place my faith in her because I know she's been good to me. She's made promises. She's kept them. This actually came up for me in the hospital a fair bit, because there were many times when I was in a state of confusion, when I was having to undergo some treatments that were not pleasant. I remember one time early on, I have memories of this. I was still in ICU, and I was on a type of dialysis that was making me really, really cold, because they were had a cooling effect on the blood as it went through. And they were worried about my brain, if I still had a brain. And it's kind of a funny scenario, because I said I'm concerned that I might be hypothermic. And they're like, okay, I think his brain's okay. But I really felt and I was scared. I was trying to communicate to her, and my memory's fuzzy. I can't remember if I still had the trach or whatever and couldn't actually talk, but I'm trying to say to her, I'm really, really worried. I don't think you understand how cold I am, and I feel like this is dangerous, right? I'm in the middle of the ICU. They're monitoring all my vitals, but I'm kind of half there and half not there. But I had to trust her. And over and over and over again, I had to entrust her with these decisions because she was my, she had that legal place. And I could do that. And I could trust her more than I trusted the doctors even though she wasn't the doctor, because she had this history with me. I remember I even used to, when she wasn't around, I'd be lying on the bed and I'd be looking underneath the curtains for her feet. Because I was just in that desperate place, right? She was just such a comfort to me, even though she couldn't fix my situation. She was a comfort to me, and I would watch for her sneakers to appear under the curtains. So that trust changes everything. So what does the Bible actually direct us to do? Well, one of the places we can turn to is the Psalms. The Psalms are kind of like the worship liturgy of Israel. There's like 150 of them. It's long. Often they're in the form of poetry. There's a lot of diversity about the Psalms. And I'm going to draw a little bit from Todd Billings here. So he's the one that's still dealing with this incurable cancer. And the Psalms have been such a place of encouragement to him. Not in a way that's just like put on a happy face, though. The Psalms are very real. So a couple things he writes. He writes, praying the Psalms allows every part of us to come before the triune God, to be seen by him as his adopted son or daughter, to praise, complain, even vent before the Almighty. God can handle our laments and our petitions. Our laments pivot on God's promises. And then elsewhere he writes this. He says, in the wake of my own diagnosis and entrance into chemo, I can say that my response was not simple. At times I would cry out to God in grief. Along with this, I would lament and protest to God for the sake of my young children. At times I responded in gratitude for and awe of all the gifts that God had already given, even if my life were not to be extended much longer. God is faithful to his promises, and his loving gifts each day are lavish and amazing, and I sometimes sense that deeply. I found myself taking solace in these different yet complementary modes of praying and living before God. Lament in grieving, praise, lament in protest, trust. There were many open questions, more than I could embody or express at any given moment. Thus, the diversity of modes of praying that I found in the Psalms and in the Christian community around me was a buoy, like a buoy that guides boats. So I love that sense of these are prayers, but they're prayers that actually draw us into a world and give us language to express a full range of human emotion. Now, unfortunately, in the church, we cherry pick from the Psalms quite often. We'll read the first few verses and leave out the nasty parts because some of them we struggle like, how can I say this? This seems like, but we forget they're there not necessarily to exemplify what we should be doing or how we should be feeling, but to give honest expression to it. And for us to give that to God so that he can deal with it rather than us taking vengeance, for example, or doing something that might not be appropriate. So one of the themes that comes up is lament. There are many psalms of lament that are not just put on a happy face. Now, they often do turn to God and say, you're a God of promises, and I believe you will deliver me. But that doesn't mean you're going to deliver me from everything or that it's going to be easy. It just means in the long run, I know I can trust you because of your history with your people. So here's an example. I'll read it through quickly, but just notice how raw this psalm is. So this is from Psalm 44, and you can hear the complaints to God, the venting. But now you have rejected and humbled us, the psalmist writes. You no longer go out with our armies. You made us retreat before the enemy, and our adversaries have plundered us. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, gaining nothing from their sale. You have made us a reproach to our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You have made us a byword among the nations. The people shake their heads at us. I live in disgrace all day long, and my face is covered with shame at the taunts of those who reproach and revile me because of the enemy who is bent on revenge. All this came upon us, though we had not forgotten you. We had not been false to your covenant. Our hearts had not turned back, our feet had not strayed from your path, but you crushed us and made us a haunt for jackals. You covered us over with deep darkness. Awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and our oppression? And amazingly, this is not a kind of prayer that God rejects or becomes defensive at or says, that's not a pious way to pray. This has actually been preserved, in the tradition of the church, because there's a belief that this is God's word. It's to draw us in to how God can meet us and deal with us. God's big enough for this. He's not defensive, can't be thrown off. My wife told me a story about her father. He's Cypriot. He grew up in Cyprus. And he grew up during a time when there was a fair bit of violence. So they had the Turkish occupation. He's Greek. And he went through a fair bit of suffering, abandonment from, parents, and kind of growing up on his own, being recruited into, sort of like distributing news for people so they can know what was going on as a young kid, going into the theater and scattering news and stuff like that. And having to watch friends of his, be executed. And, so he's this young boy. He has a faith in God, but I love this picture where, my wife tells me at this time where he would go to the sea and he would throw rocks at God. This little boy who would go and throw rocks at God in his anger. And we might think that's not faith. That's the opposite of faith. But it actually is faith because he's throwing rocks at God. Right? It's a kind of faith that's big enough to say, I can be honest, I can be real here. And that's what's in the Psalms. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a fitting response then. So we've talked about theodicies, and they tend to be sort of speculative, a little bit rationalistic. What's the kind of response that God actually gives us? It's interesting that the Bible isn't that interested in theodicy. It nowhere really explains where evil comes from. It just kind of says evil's there. Now this is how you deal with it. That's kind of its predominant message. So a fitting response, if God is, now I know not everybody necessarily believes, so I'm not pushing you into that. I'm just sort of saying, if God is this kind of being, what might that imply for us in terms of honoring this God and living in response to suffering? Let me quote Gandalf, coming back to the Lord of the Rings. There's this conversation he has with Frodo in the mines of Moria, and Frodo, who's been tasked with this very daunting, almost impossible task. It's going to take all of his energy, right? And Frodo says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. I think there's something kind of very biblical about that, actually. And maybe it's coming from Tolkien's Catholicism. And so we have a crucified God in the Christian tradition. One who goes to a cross for our sake, who enters into solidarity with his people. He doesn't send them a philosophy. He comes in person and enters into it, even suffering and death so that he can conquer death and draw us into a new life of possibilities. And he says to his disciples, the Gospel of Mark's very interesting because the cross is a prominent theme in Mark, not just as an event, but this is what life looks like as a disciple or follower of Jesus. The way of Jesus is the way of the cross, and so the way of the disciple is also the way of the cross. And Jesus will say, and this is repeated in the other synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, all together, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. This gets discussed within the context of community in the Pauline letters. The Apostle Paul, he writes to one of the early Christian communities, and this is a community that's experiencing some division, and people aren't getting along. It's like, I'm better than you, and now you're better than, all that kind of stuff that humans do. And Paul says, look to Jesus, who's supposed to be the center of your faith. In your relationships, he writes, with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And then he goes on to say, who, even though he was God, didn't consider his rights as God as something to be grasped onto, but took this form of a human and became a servant and served others, demonstrated his greatness by serving others, even to the point of them shaming him and ultimately killing him. And he says that if that's what your Lord does for you, surely you can live as a servant to each other in the context of the community. Here's another passage from the book of Acts. So this is after the Holy Spirit comes, or the big story of Pentecost. What's the first thing that characterizes the church at its birth? This is a powerful passage. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. We've sort of gotten away from this, right? This is a book by a sociologist named Rodney Stark, and in it he talks about research he did on the early church. He was actually a skeptic and sort of believed the church was just corrupt, and often the church has been corrupt, right? But he went and researched the early church tradition and was just kind of blown away at what he found. Things like early Christians who would go into villages when the plague struck. Everybody else would be fleeing. Christians would go in order to care for the sick and the dying because they didn't fear death. Or the Roman practice of killing baby girls or leaving them on the garbage dumps, right? Because they weren't valued. The Christians would go in, they'd rescue them, they would adopt them, because one of the major images for salvation in the New Testament is the image of adoption, right? That it's like we're not God's children, but He's brought us in and made us His. And so this led to a practice, and this is what God does. This is what we should do. We should adopt. We should rescue, and so forth. And he cites a number of other things like that. Very, very interesting. And I think here's where my reflections about science and Christians in the sciences really come into play. One of the things that I find that characterizes Christians in the science, and I would say not just Christians, I think lots of scientists, because they're human beings, have this sense that they want to serve humanity, that they want to alleviate suffering, and that they want to do that in very practical ways. Now, sometimes it's hard to explain where a motivation like that comes from. Like, why should we care for the lowest of the low? That's not a self-evident idea. It's not universal. And it certainly isn't the predominant idea through human history. Like, usually there are those that deserve help and then those that don't, right? Or there's some kind of social Darwinism at work, or some karmic system that determines just deserts that people have, what they deserve because of former lives or whatever. That's common in human history. So why do we have this belief that every human being matters and has dignity? Like, where do you find that dignity? You look at it under a microscope and it's, oh, there's the dignity cell right there. There's the bit of DNA with the dignity in it. Like, what is dignity? It's not a thing. It's an idea. But where does it come from? Right? And so in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we trace this back to the notion of the image of God. And it's not just one tribe, one group, one gender, whatever. It's all people everywhere have this dignity inherently because God declares it to be so. So I've encountered this a lot with scientists I meet. So I'm a theologian. I'm not a scientist, but I love being around scientists because, A, I want to learn about science in ways that are actually scientific. And sometimes in the church, we don't deal with questions of science very well. Found them threatening. So I like to learn. I'm there to learn. And I'm there to be a bridging voice, mostly, and to reflect theologically on what we're seeing in God's world. So I meet a lot of people that really inspire me because they have a passion to serve God with their science, right? They're not like what you think of when you think of like the caricature of the scientist, like cold, calculating robot that just applies a method, right? There's no human, there's no like passion, there's no intuition. It's just apply the method and out will spit the results, right? Einstein and others have reflected on that and says that's not actually how science works, right? But I see people of passion, people who care about their world and want to make a difference in all kinds of ways. I think of people like Francis Collins. You can go and watch his Templeton speech and how he relates his passion for science along with his passion for people and for God. And he's one of the most famous scientists in the world, right? He's a geneticist and led the Human Genome Project, was the director of National Institutes of Health for many years, and really kind of ties these themes together in terms of what drives his passion for implementing science in the world. Catherine Hayhoe, very different kind of scientist. She's an environmental scientist. She's an evangelical, but really breaks the mold in terms of her passion for addressing climate change and helping the church to understand what's going on and to be equipped and to take these things seriously. Oh, her global weirding videos, by the way, are fascinating. I don't know if you've seen these. They're on YouTube. You can go in and search them, and they're quick, like often 5 or 7 minute videos that explain questions that people have about climate change and how she addresses them. She's very good and brings it to a level people can engage with. Here's a man I met while I was out in Manitoba. He's a Canadian, really a hero in Canadian medical work. So he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's been awarded an officer of the Order of Canada. He's a Canadian doctor, microbiologist, really instrumental in researching infectious diseases, specifically sexually transmitted diseases. And he did groundbreaking work on HIV/AIDS in Africa at a time when that was, a lot of Christians would have found that taboo to be doing that kind of work. And he's received, you can actually look at videos online. I found there's a Canadian video that celebrates, other recipients of the reward, and you kind of see what he contributed. And so he was part of starting the CSCA chapter in Winnipeg when I was out there. And just such a personable guy, right? So not like a cold calculating robot. He quite evidently is driven by his love for God and his passion for human beings made in God's image. And so that's why he took those, 80 trips to Africa or whatever it is that he did, and does the work that he does. We can also think of initiatives like hospice care, or hospitals, the rise of universities and the pursuit of knowledge to better humanity. We can think of soup kitchens. We can think of World Vision. We can think of the Salvation Army. I think these are really good, actually embodied, lived theodicies. So they're not just, philosophical answers. As important as those can be, these are actual responses that make a difference. And it seems to be in line with the kind of thing that God did. God didn't send us a book only. He sent us his son, who entered into all of that. So I think where I'd like to end is to just suggest that I think this suggests something about science, and particularly about scientists, maybe, because scientists are human beings. And it says that science actually can have a vocational sense, right? Science isn't just a career. It's not just something you do to make money. It's actually a kind of calling, at least in a kind of Christian perspective, because it's a calling to understand God's world and to serve humanity in very practical ways that understand this created world that God made. And it doesn't set God's book of words against God's book of nature. It sees them as being complementary. And in so doing, to bring real science to the world, but to also bring a deeply ethical, humanizing approach to why it is that we do what we do. So I am part of the ASA and the CSCA proudly because I look around me and I see people called by God to do scientific work in a vocational sense, and to help alleviate the suffering of our world in very practical and concrete ways. I wouldn't be alive without them. And so I'm deeply thankful. God can work directly. I do believe that, but I believe that a lot of the time he works through indirect means. He made this world. He made it to function in certain ways. You'd think that he would let it do its work, right? And we get to be part of that. So thank you very much for your attention tonight and for engaging in these thoughts. And I can take some time to take some questions. Go ahead. Yeah. And I'm okay to kind of go anywhere. I know this is a different kind of a topic, right? So it can be, ask whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, we touched upon a lot of concepts and things like that. So I guess my question is that in your talk, you don't mention, like, when it comes to suffering, you mentioned it's an outside factor, but you never mentioned anything about the person might be responsible then in a, with their suffering.
Okay.
So I'm just going to give an example. So, I mean, if you eat McDonald's every day and you end up with diabetes or whatever, then it's not that God hates you or whatever. And I mean,
there are natural consequences.
Well, that's right. I mean, the main cause is because you've been eating McDonald's every day, kind of thing.
Yes.
So I think the fact that you end up with diabetes is a logical consequence. Or that's the consequence. But you don't mention anything about the person being responsible for their own.
Yeah. And just so thank you. That's important to acknowledge. One of the questions I got asked the most, Joseph and I were talking about this today, was, are you a smoker? Because we don't understand how this happened to you. You seem to be relatively active, and so on and so forth. And we don't understand why this happened to you. Are you a smoker? That would explain it. I'm not a smoker. but that can be a factor, often is a factor. So yeah, that would come up. I didn't address that directly.
Always blame somebody else.
Sure, blame somebody else. No, that would come up under the free will idea. That part of, partly what explains suffering in the world has to do with human freedom. When we make bad choices, we can bring suffering on ourselves. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Now that gets really complicated because choices are complicated, right? Because we're socially conditioned creatures, and sometimes somebody makes a bad choice that's bad for their life, but they've come out of an abusive home. And so the agency gets very complicated. But I think at a face level, we need to own up that we have responsibility, that we can make choices that are harmful to us and to others. Right. So I'll just acknowledge that. Yeah. So it's a good explanation. It's important. At the same time, of course, freedom it's a complicated thing because we're social creatures and we don't all make the same choices with the same factors and opportunities and, all of that, weaknesses and strengths. But, I think a good way to say it is whatever we've been given, we kind of have responsibility for that. We're not all given the same. So that's kind of to the extent that I can make good choices, I should. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, as far as the possibility of making our own choices, but then there's the evil corporate greed, those that benefit off the tobacco and McDonald's and sugar, and so you take that. I guess logically, there's that evil.
Yeah.
Greed.
No, that's well said. So I'm someone that does believe in freedom. It's hard to explain and everything, but I do believe that there's free will, that there's freedom, but it's a complicated thing. I think a lot of us think that we're freer than we actually are because we'll say, oh yeah, I went out and I bought that, whatever, right? Because I wanted it. Well, why did you want it? Right? Your desire has been shaped by what's depicted as desirable. And we're mimetic creatures. Because René Girard talks about that. We desire what others desire. And when people find something desirable, suddenly we all find that desirable. And that can function. People profit off that. So yeah, no, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just blown away by your own personal story and your journey. And I feel like running up and wrapping the bubble wrap around you. Just I'm wondering what is your explanatory model for what happened to you? Where did that come from? How do you make sense of it? You told us the story, but much less about your thoughts about what happened to you, and particularly in relationship to God.
Yeah, honestly, I'm still processing. I think a lot. In my case, I've had it's worked out positively for me in many ways. And so that definitely colors, although that wasn't always the case. There was a lot of ambiguity along the way. I didn't know how things would turn out. And then there are after effects too. You deal with the trauma that comes on from that. And for the first couple of years, especially, something would get me going and I'd suddenly feel like something's going wrong and, dealing with all that. So Yeah, I don't know. What I do know is God was present to me. So this is just on my own faith, right? God was present to me. It wasn't always easy. It would sometimes be both at once. There was actually a time when my wife was there and she said, God is here. I said, yeah, but that's not helping me. But there were times when it did help me. And one of the amazing things was the community that came around us. So I like feeling the embodiment of God and all of that. So it's one of those tricky things because, again, it could be said cheaply. It could be said, well, because I went through this, so many lives were impacted in some very deep and profound ways. I could tell you story after story of people that were really positively impacted, but that's not always the case. You know, somebody dies in the Holocaust, let's say, and there's no evident positive outcome of that, right? And so I'm really careful about that. But in my case, it was resting into that. It was having this sense. So for me, it kind of changed my outlook a little bit. So another thing people would ask me a lot would be, you know, do you have obviously you're here for a reason, I would get. So do you have a strong sense now of like, you know, what you're here to do and almost like an ambition or something. And actually my sense was the opposite. It was, I think I'm less ambitious. And what I've been redirected to is to be present, like to be present in my home with my kids, my wife. It really changed my perspective on those kinds of things. I had a strong sense that, you know, these Psalms that talk about, you know, life is here and then it's gone. It's like springs up in the morning like a flower and then withers by the end of the day. So I had a very strong sense of my mortality and a strong sense that I'm kind of here on assignment. I have no idea how long. It could be 2 years. It could be 10 years. None of us really know, but it kind of brings that home. So I think it's led me to wrestle just with what's in front of me, what I'm supposed to be. I'm not particularly troubled about the problems because I think the potential solutions around these questions are so vast and complicated and you need infinite information and even if I know, how would it help me? Kind of thing. So I think it's those kinds of things that have been helpful for me.
Where you found me in what you went through. Oh, was it to get you to the place? You think you're in a better place now, where you're letting go of maybe various ambitions?
I think so.
And more present.
In my case, yes, I think so. Along some of those things that I talked about. Even things like understanding, like as I was healing and using a walker and understanding like viscerally why it is that older people fall. And I always used to think, oh, they just lose their balance or something. But I realized that when you have no strength, you know, you suddenly slip. You don't have a reaction. You don't like down you go, right? And so like just perspective, things like that. The
fact that they're on medication.
Well, that doesn't help either. Yeah. And dealing with that, right? Dealing with blood pressure changes and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. A lot of it was local, though. It was to appreciate the present, to appreciate what's in front of me.
Do you feel like, how did it affect your relationship with God or your walk with God, your faith? Going through all this, if you think of maybe how you were before and now after, you see changes.
Well, you know, it's funny. Sometimes if I focus on that too much, I actually get depressed. Because I'm like, I was dead and then I got new life. You'd think I would be this amazing person who's always good, who treats his wife and kids well. And it's just amazing how quickly I can relapse into just being a jerk. And it's like, that's frustrating. And then I realize, but on the positive side, I realized that I've been given something. It had nothing to do with me. I didn't deserve it. I didn't earn it. It was a sheer kind of gift. Actually, one of the things that struck me when I was reflecting on this friend of ours that died, and I was thinking, I was so grateful, but I also felt a little bit of like, why not her? And why me? Why do I get to live? And the strongest thing I had just occurred to me was because this isn't about you. And it was just that sense that, yeah, there's something bigger going on. And so, yeah. Yeah, so I think in response, that sense of just the graciousness of God and the unexpectedness of it, that I'm just grateful for.
Thank you for the talk. It made me recall the darkest times. I want to share two things. First is I strongly related to your story about your wife when she calls or the way answers. Sometimes I experience that too from some of that. Also, when I think through it myself, it resonates better than when I hear the exactly same thing from other people.
Yes.
And what strikes me is actually, I've been there, and then I know that I shouldn't say anything to someone who goes through the same thing. There's temptation to say something. So, it's kind of relapse too.
Yes.
And it's really, like, I'm even afraid that I could have never learned this if I hadn't been the place I was. So it makes me think that I should be very, very humble. Really I should try to walk with a person.
Yeah.
Experience.
Yeah.
If I don't want to take any of the pain at all, I shouldn't say anything. And the second is that I also thought my intellectual side actually aggravates my pain because I ask why. And I happen to become a scientist. So I think scientists can be drawn to that because I am a neuroscientist and we are largely reductionists. We explain things, explain our mind and behavior. So we tend to think if you know the mechanism or cause, we can treat that perfectly. And science is based in one of the Western I see from the ancient Greek is they want to explain things first, and the Eastern world rather pursues applications first. That's how I kind of see it. So I just kind of wonder if there's actually intellectual ground that makes us ask why. Respond.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Like from a neurological perspective, you're wondering.
Oh no, actually, I would if I were to study in that area, I would be very curious to know that there's actually cultural difference.
Yeah.
Or how much this tendency to seek for mechanism intellectually is correlated with how open we ask why.
I see.
Try to explain things rather than.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So the why. What does why mean? Right. And that can point to actually a variety of things that we might mean by that. We tend to reduce why to causation, but that doesn't consider agency or purpose necessarily, or and those things are hard for scientists because, like, you know, I can analyze somebody's brain or whatever, but how do I know the deep intentions or plans or whatever? That gets trickier to try to figure. And then if I'm trying to think on what's the divine mind, like, that's just way beyond what we can analyze by cause and effect, causal relationships. So that's, I think that's just, I just want to say that's an insightful comment, right? That we've been shaped to think about what the question why even means, and to think certain ways of posing that are legitimate or intellectual, and other ways of posing it aren't. Maybe. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. You sound like a bit of a philosopher too. Yes?
You use the book of Job to address the question who God is. Can you say more about the beginning of the book of Job, that the conversation between God and, is it called Satan? Whatever that name?
Yes.
It seems that's such a setup for the rest of the story. Could you say more about?
Yeah. So that's not my field of expertise, so I'll just say that to be a little bit careful. So yeah, in the opening of Job, it's a very puzzling kind of a thing, right? Because it's sort of this heavenly scene where the Satan creature, and I know biblical scholars will say don't confuse the Satan necessarily with the devil. There's an emergence of this character, the devil, throughout Scripture, and the Hebrew just has to do with someone who seems to have a position in the heavenly courts as a kind of advocate or spy. So it's very anthropomorphic. This is like somebody who's sort of like God's commissioned spy to spy out and see how things are going on earth, to report back, to prod a little bit, to be a kind of prosecutor in a way. So I think, I don't fully know what's going on. We've got to be careful of passages like that. Like, is it meant to be a big metaphysic? Or is it meant to be a dramatic setup to the story that happens, right? Because the genre is a little bit, it's not clear fully what it is. So what are we supposed to get theologically? Well, I think what the early chapters establish is partly what's going on is that God is absolutely pleased with this Job person. So it sets up the drama for that. And it also sets up this sense that this other voice, this adversarial voice, wants to really test this out and to push it hard. And God kind of allows it. So again, I don't think it's necessarily trying to answer a metaphysical question about why bad things happen. It's more like a dramatic scene that's anthropomorphic, that throws us into evil. And then we live through the book of Job to see, well, what are the responses that come up and how does God respond to these various answers? And we don't actually get an answer in Job. I mean, that's the fascinating thing. We don't get told what the answer is. We're just sort of told kind of what the best response is and how are we to engage evil. One commentator I was reading recently thought that Job might exist in order to be, like, there's counter tensions in the Bible. So there's books like wisdom books, like let's say the Proverbs. It's kind of like, if you follow this wisdom, things will go well for you, generally speaking. But then there's books like Ecclesiastes, which are the counter voice. It's like, well, it's all meaningless. And sometimes good people suffer just as much as bad people, and it's all like a big mess, right? And it's almost like they're placed together so that the readers in the community wrestle between those two perspectives. Another example is the question in the Old Testament, is it good or bad for us to have a king? Depends if you're reading Kings or Chronicles. One of them shows you the kind of horrors of that. The other one tries to kind of elevate it. And it's like, there's no answer. It's kind of like you have to deal with those tensions, right? And wrestle with them. And I think in Job, what this one scholar was saying is that you've got the Deuteronomic tradition, which is the giving of God's law, and almost this sense that we're in this relationship. God's got his part. We have our part. And there are consequences for breaking that. And Job is the counter voice that says, well, sometimes bad things are just happening. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that somebody's a lawbreaker, right? Because that's not what Job is. So I think there's a bunch of stuff going on there, but I think some of that's a bit dramatic in terms of, so we got to remember that the word, the Satan, is actually it's not a proper name. It's a descriptor. And then there's a history of that name. I actually have a friend who's doing a PhD on the emergence of the Satan character through biblical and extra biblical literature. It's interesting stuff. If you were to go back to the ancient Near East and hear that, nobody would be thinking that. Yeah. But what happens is the canon reflects back on it. It's always drawing up older themes into new situations and adding layers of meaning. And so that gets drawn up into a consistent pattern of how we are tempted in ways that, disobey God but also destroy ourselves. And then also there's how Christ emerges to kind of be a victor over that. So, yeah, so I think there's a layering of meaning that takes place as Scripture moves forward.
What do you think about God allowing suffering because the people, I guess Jewish people at that time, rejected God or turned away from God?
Yeah, that seems to be a clear possibility of what happens at time. Now, I have to be really, really careful in saying that because, as a non-Jewish person to say, well, God did this to the Jews or something, that could be a really dicey thing to get into. But within the Jewish tradition itself, there is that reflection in the prophets, because Israel is called out to be special in a way, to be God's representatives. Yeah, and in the sense it goes back to Abraham, right? It's chosenness and its particularity, but it's for the sake of the whole. Because God chooses Abraham, but says, through you, I'm going to bless all nations of the earth. And that promise is repeated multiple times, right? But sometimes, like any group, like Christians or anybody else, that special vocation could be received as a kind of privilege. And then the prophets come along to say, you're living like privileged people, but you're not caring for the poor. You're not honoring God the way you should, and so forth. And so, yeah, there is a whole story about God allowing them to suffer the consequences of their bad choices as well. Yeah. The danger is always us thinking we know the reason. Like there we have the benefit of God actually telling us the reason, if you believe in Scripture representing God's word. It's very dangerous though for us to become to give myself the authority of a Scripture writer and to say, well, this natural disaster over there happened because of such and such, right? That's very...
But the thing is, you either believe the Bible is true or it's not. That's the beginning point.
Sure. So I could hear what it says, let's say about the Israelites going into captivity in Babylon. And I could say, okay, yes, this is kind of what God's saying about why this happened. But sometimes what people will do in a modern day is to say, well, this, hurricane hit someplace and God's angry and is judging this people. But the Bible doesn't tell us that. We're making that huge, contextual divergence and then deduction. So that's where we have to be more careful. And that's what God chastises Job's friends for. It's like God says, I have the right to tell you why certain things are happening, but you don't have the right to say with divine authority, why these things are happening to people. So it's a bit of both. Yeah.
My sense is that people in the 21st century feel like suffering is an abomination. Suffering is, people shouldn't suffer. Mm-hmm. And my sense, and I'm not sure what I base it on, is that people 100, 200 years ago felt that suffering was simply a part of life. Yeah. And it was easier to accept, and yes. Among people of faith anyway, that one should be thankful in all things. And, do you share that sense that somehow suffering has taken on a different meaning over the centuries, especially in our modern world where, oh my God, my AC has cut out, I'm suffering, it shouldn't happen. We should never suffer, we should never have anything else, we should never, and that somehow it's added to have suffering.
Yeah. I do think so. I think you're right about that. I think that's just a fact, because that's part, like even things like when you actually look back at like life expectancy over the centuries, it's really shocking how recent our life expectancy has just, and all the gains that have been made in 100 or 200 years, even in terms of things like, moving from real poverty to, betterment of situations. So we are extremely wealthy people, right, living in a place like Canada. And right.
In the Old Testament, didn't the people live much longer than 120?
We'll save that one for another time. But generally speaking, right? So if we get past that period, let's say, there's a very low life expectancy for most of our history, and not only that, but infant mortality and all these kinds of things, and inability to diseases that would be a yawner for us today. It would be quite devastating earlier. Everything, I would not be alive, that's for sure. So and we have all the comforts we need, right? Like we all want more, but we have an incredible amount. Like it's ridiculous, really. Like we really do live like you wouldn't want to be a king in the ancient world. You wouldn't. You have it better now. Most of us, right? I don't want to be flippant about that, but
not if you're a king.
Not if you're a king today. If you're the king of Jordan or whatever, yeah. But no, I think you're right, and I think that colors our vision of things. We have a youth culture as well. We don't understand death. We don't understand dying. We shy away from suffering, and so I do think that colors it, and it colors how we read the Bible, even because the Bible can be a shocking book for us. Because we read it as privileged people who live in peace. We don't read it like it's written to underdogs. It's written to marginalized people that are oppressed. And so when you hear it from that context, some of the extremities kind of make sense. It's like, God, rise up and defend us for Pete's sake. Right? So, but if I'm a privileged person and I say that, God, go defeat my enemies, it's sort of like that removes it from that location. But I think we do. I think we struggle with that. I think we really need to think through matters of suffering. I don't think we want to pursue suffering for its own sake. We should seek to alleviate it, but it's amazing how we will protect our own comfort, before sacrificing that for others quite often. So I think that's what I would want to be really cautious of.
I'd like to just add in that naturally a Western perspective in a country like this,
right,
because people have gotten so used to having so much and rarely having diseases that kill people and not seeing babies die. But, I've spent a few decades in developing countries in Africa, especially a very underdeveloped one. In 10 years there, I can tell you where 12 graves are of people that have died, and a lot of them were little kids. And whereas here, we don't see that very often. I'm just talking about one village. But people there have a very different idea, because they're not used to the kind of life we have here, with very little suffering and with no hunger and, water just turn on the tap.
Yes.
There's so many things. So it's a very sort of modern Western perspective to say that, because in much of the world,
and that's what I meant.
Have that same attitude towards suffering.
Right.
It's much more a part of everyday life, and they're not asking those kinds of questions necessarily.
Yes.
And yet some have joy and they trust in God. They can be joyful and thankful. Everything's relative in a way, depending on what you're used to and what your expectations are.
That's right.
Because people here have certain expectations, which is normal, of what life should be like.
Yeah.
And yet,
that's not reflective of the world.
No.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
So what about death? So suffering very often leads to death. In our modern Western world, are you think that suffering is horrible because death is, and it has the attitude towards death being over time, where if somebody dies, it's absolutely horrible. Whereas if you're a Christian, not so horrible.
Yeah, and I think that's true. There's a nuanced answer to that, because there are places. I remember knowing some missionaries in Malawi, and there's a lot of child deaths there due to AIDS, because they've received it through blood or whatever, and it can actually lead to a hardening where nobody wants to commit to anybody, because part of the ministry had to do with those who were pastors had to take on adopted children, because that had to be done, because people wouldn't commit because it's too risky and too painful. So there is a sense in which there's a both and there. It's good that we don't deal with so much death, but it can also be illusory, because we can be under the illusion that we're just never going to die, and that death is a complete unwelcome gift. People are very reticent these days, sometimes to bring children to funerals, or I know there's a whole argument about age of appropriateness, but we really do hide death from us all, right? And so no, I think that's very true. Yeah, I don't want to overglorify death, but at the same time, it's a natural part of the world. This is one of the things that we're wrestling with in theology as well. That it seems like death is built into the nature of things. So how do we think about that? And also this notion that, well, death is also an enemy and God's going to overcome it. And I think part of it is to realize that, if we go back to the garden story, the picture is not that human beings are just immortals, because the tree of life is not part of their body. It's outside of them. So it represents something they're dependent on God for. And the image of being made of the dust is an image of mortality in the ancient Near East. It's what it means. So they're not immortals inherently. They're created, and they're being offered this promise that if they walk with God, God's going to offer them a life, but they reject that. So it's complicated, right? Death it's kind of a part of us. It's not the final story, but the threat of evil is that it will be the final story. Right? It is the last word. And that's what evil really does when it seeks to serve death. It means death is the end. It's the final enemy. And then faith is, well, no, it's not. There's no overcoming of death. So, yeah. Yeah. And Joseph, just feel free to cut us off when time is done.
Yeah, we should keep this thing soon.
So did you want one more? Last one? Yeah. Want some time we'll hang out for a while. So yeah, go ahead.
When you're presenting CSCA, ask what good, what is good, what and I'm often concerned about having this pleasure generation. And it's kind of, I see an irony there. Because on one hand, you are the most scientifically advanced, also the most atheist generation. But at the same time, science actually tells nothing about the value of pleasure and happiness in life. And some, popular scientists forward to the idea that it is actually, so it's very ironic. And then I was wondering, what does it actually mean? If you can say God is happy, I mean, or do we share the profit with God, or is it?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big one. You are a philosopher. Yeah, this comes up in the ancient church. There's lots of discussions about, can God experience suffering, or does God experience passion? And the classical tradition in theology has often said, God is not a passionate being. And the heart of that tradition, though, is not to say that God is incapable of experiencing certain things. It's to say that what we name when we name human emotions are incapable of naming God's experience. So, for example, if we might say, if God can't experience some kind of passionate response, then he can't identify with us. But we don't realize the downside of that is that, well, that means God's love can wane and wax, right? And so the emphasis on that classical tradition is not to say that God doesn't experience things. It's to say that he's fully stable, that he's maximally loving. And it's always an overflow of that. It's not something that, so when we use words like God gets angry, we think of human beings, and it's sort of like you stub your toe, you fly off the handle, somebody insults you, you get defensive. So we can talk about God being angry, but it's never in those kinds of ways. And so there's a distancing and there's both continuity and discontinuity, we might say.
Didn't God show his anger when taking the Noah's flood, when only the people that were on the boat were saved, but everybody else?
Yeah, so if you guys...
I believe he was angry at that time, or he will...
Well, the word it actually says is that he was grieved. And so, and that's actually an important detail, because there are several ancient accounts of the flood in various ancient Eastern literature. And the main reason that the flood happens in most of those accounts is that the gods get fed up with the noise that human beings are creating. Because the humans were created to be slaves of the gods, to do the labors they didn't want to do. And so they're not created to be friends or to be, co-managers. They're created to be slaves. And in the Genesis account, it's a very, very different kind of a feel. This actually, God creates humans to be his covenant partners, to be his co-creators, right? Go be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And the reason God sends the flood in Genesis is not because he gets arbitrarily angry, but because every thought of every human was evil all the time. And you have this spiral of killing and violence and depravity. So God is grieved at that. And yes, the response strikes us as very dramatic, but noticing the reason is really, really important, because that's what actually contrasts in that ancient setting. It's not arbitrary, it's not flying off the handle, it's a kind of measured response to human destruction.
But he wasn't happy.
He wasn't happy, that's for sure. Yeah, that's for sure.
I think I'll end it. Good name.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah.